Well, welcome to today's Tuesday Talk on Demarcating Transdisciplinary Research in Sustainability Science, 5 clusters of research modes based on evidence from 59 research projects by Jahn. Stephanie is currently a PhD candidate at the Leuphana University of Lüneburg, and in addition, she is a coordinator of the research project revolving at the Environmental Research Center in Leipzig. Her background is in sociology, and her research focuses on the quantitative exploration of inter- and transdisciplinary research in the German science system. Moreover, she has been working on the social benefits of research in research information systems and the implementation of sustainability-oriented research in higher education institutions. As we are at the ISS also working on inter- and transdisciplinary research and are particularly interested in theories, methods, culture, and practices of these types of research, and have several research groups also on the topic, like, for example, there's one headed by Steve Williams here in the room. We invited her to give a Tuesday talk based on her rich experiences and look forward to the discussion. Just before we start, please keep in mind that we record the session. And now, without wasting any further time, Stephanie, please, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you, Achim, for the introduction. And of course, also thank you, Stephen, for the kind invitation. I will now share my screen with you. I hope it works. So yeah, today I will present the findings of a collaborative research effort that has taken place at the Leuphana University in Lüneburg within the research project Modes of Sustainability-Related Research and Comparison, MONA, and the project was funded by the German Research Foundation and was led by Jens Newig and Daniel Lang, and also Judith Kahle and Matthias Bergmann, who is also today here in this meeting, contributed to this work. Yeah, the work is already published in the journal Sustainable Development, by the way. So as we started our analysis or investigation, we focused on the following research problems. So we discovered a tension between the theory of transdisciplinary research, which is mainly shaped by blueprints and ideal typical models of transdisciplinary research, which also somehow have the notion of a duality of transdisciplinary research versus non-transdisciplinary research. While on the other hand, in the actual experiences of transdisciplinary research projects, we see that the actual research practices vary in the expression of transdisciplinarity because the projects adjust to specific research problems or funding structures or stakeholder fields and so on. So we thought that, it is more reasonable to assume that despite of the duality of TD versus non-TD research in theory, a spectrum of more or less transdisciplinary research projects exists. And the guiding question for this, for our analysis then was within this spectrum that we assume of more or less transdisciplinary research projects, can we identify different research modes? So can we find clusters of projects that somehow are similar? And we used a theoretical framework that is, in a wider sense, an adaptation of the ideal typical research process as defined by Thomas Jahn, Matthias Bergmann, and later on also Daniel Lang. And we assumed that according to the different characteristics of the research projects, that they would somehow manifest themselves in a multidimensional space of research mode characteristics. And here we assumed that they would vary in their degree of real world orientation in their degree of intensity of interaction with the practitioners, and also that they would vary in the specific contributions that the non-academic actors make to the project. And then we also assumed that the projects not randomly locate within this multidimensional space, but cluster around specific research modes. So yeah, this was the main idea. And then we were also interested if we were able to really find these research modes, how would they perform in terms of research outputs and impacts, and not only academic outputs and impacts like peer-reviewed articles, books, and so on, and their citation, but also in terms of societal outputs. So, for example, whether they made guidelines for practitioners or information events, and so on. And of course, very important also the societal impacts of these research projects. So whether the research results would be recognized or applied to a certain degree in society. And to analyze this, we collected information on 59 research projects within the German funding context. So all projects were either funded by the German Ministry for Research and Education or the German Research Foundation, and they all had to be sustainability related and interdisciplinary with a substantial social science share. We gathered information on these projects via an adaptation of the case survey method, where we applied a coding scheme and a questionnaire. And the coding scheme we used for systematic document analysis, and the questionnaire we used for interviews with the project PIs. And the resulting data was analyzed in a cluster analysis. And indeed, we were able to identify 5 distinct clusters of research modes via this method in the data. And now I'd like to describe a little bit the clusters that we found in detail. So I will start with the first cluster that we found. We call this cluster purely academic research cluster. It is the smallest cluster that we found, and it is characterized by the fact that no practitioners were actively involved in these research projects. What we found in terms of their societal outputs and impacts was that they showed substantial societal productivity and also societal impact. But what is mainly characterizing this cluster is that it has by far the highest academic productivity and academic impact of all the clusters that we found. Then I will go to the second cluster that we found, the cluster that we call practice consultation cluster, because the research contributions in this cluster, the form of practitioner interaction in this cluster is mainly described by practitioners being consulted to provide knowledge to the project in a more or less one-way information flow. And we see that in this cluster, like in also other clusters, but here mainly private actors and actors from the governmental sector are involved in these projects. And looking at the outputs and impacts of this cluster, we see that the societal outputs and impacts are barely existent, but still these clusters show high academic productivity in terms of numbers of publications and also these publications are to a certain degree cited. Then we come to the third cluster, the cluster for selective, which we call selective practitioner involvement. And here, practitioners are mainly involved in short-term collaborations. And also, like in the practice consultation cluster, we see that the main contributions of practitioners is also the provision of knowledge. But still in this cluster, to a certain degree, this knowledge is structured by the application of structured methods of knowledge integration. In this cluster, it's the cluster with the highest share of governmental actors involved in research projects. And when we look at the outputs and impacts, we see that it has lower levels of societal productivity and societal impact, but still substantial academic productivity and academic impact. And the next two clusters are substantially more interactive than the previous three clusters. We have here the cluster 4, which we call the ideal typical transdisciplinary research cluster. And in this cluster, we see that practitioners are involved in short-term collaborations, but also long-term collaborations. We see that they are involved in a large number of projects in project decisions, and also in the definition of the research problem, which is a very crucial point in the beginning of the research project. What we also see, and what demarcates this cluster from the others, is that in almost all projects in this cluster, the practitioners contributed by sharing their norms and values. And also, this cluster has the highest level of projects that applied structured methods of knowledge integration. The societal sectors and the actors that were involved are kind of balanced, I would say. And when we look at the societal outputs and impacts, we see that this cluster has the highest amount of societal outputs and impacts, while having substantially lower academic productivity and impact than the previous clusters. And looking at the characteristics of this cluster, we can see, or we would say that this combination of research mode characteristic resembles most is discussed as ideal transdisciplinary research in the literature. And we come to cluster 5, this cluster we call a practice-oriented research cluster. And here in this the practitioners are take part in the research process as equal partners, so on equal footing with the researchers. They are in all projects involved in project decisions. They contribute to the important phase of definition of the research question. It is very specific for this class that the contributions of the practitioners to the research project focus on, sorry that my connection is not so well, main focus on product development and also the provision of financial as material resources. And we look at the societal sector and also see that the private actors are very dominant in this cluster, follow, and it's the cluster with the highest share of projects involving private actors into their research. And this combination of characteristics, we find that the practice-oriented reassembles most what is discussed as applied research in literature. And look at the societal outputs. We see that both very high in compared to the other clusters, and we see that when it comes to especially academic impact, so in form of that the publications are to a certain degree rated by other papers, we said there's almost no resonance of these findings in the scientific community. Right, yes. So these 5 clusters, based on these clusters and the reflection of our methodological approach, we came with 3 tensions that somehow summarize and reflect our findings. So we started off analysis targeting this dualistic view of transdisciplinary, non-transdisciplinary research. But during the reflection of our work, we found that we are still heavily relying on another holistic conceptualization, which is the conceptual divide in science and society in transdisciplinary research, and also scholars and practitioners accordingly. And for future research, we would like to be a little open about looking at what different roles all kinds of team members of transdisciplinary projects are filling. And for example, especially when we look at our practice-oriented cluster 5, where most of the projects involve the practitioners as research partners on equal footing. So this was the first tension. Then the second tension we came up with the imbalances in the involvement and influence of different societal actor groups in transdisciplinary research. And to give an example, that what we found in our data is that especially in cluster 5, we can see that in the cluster, the practitioners have huge influence on the research process and are strongly involved research partners on equal footing. And here, for example, private actors are very dominant to a certain degree and to a high degree. And then we have clusters, for example, like the cluster 3, selective practitioner involvement, which has the highest share of clusters where actors from the civic sector were involved. So, for example, NGOs and so on. And here we see that the research mode is not so interactive and more these short-term collaborations and also low levels of projects that involve practitioners into decisions and so on. We would like to highlight this issue and also discuss whether in future there might be options to find out why there are imbalances in the involvement and influence, and when it might be visible that these occur because of limited resources or capabilities of specific actor groups, to find ways to somehow balance the sector contributions a little bit out. And then the third tension is the tension between societal and academic outputs and impacts. I think it was already visible in the table. We see that the societal impacts and outputs of the more interactive research modes seem to come at the cost of scientific outputs and impacts. And we would like to initiate a discussion about how important this tension and this balance is for transdisciplinary research, especially as still numbers of publications and citations are criteria that are most commonly used in research governance, and when it comes to research funding and also scientific careers and so on, and what influence this has on the TD community. And maybe also an interesting finding in this way, around this topic intention, is that our purely academic research cluster has rather high levels of societal productivity and also societal impact, despite no active practitioner involvement. These were the three tensions. I brought three discussion questions for the following discussion to get in an exchange, maybe a little bit about your work and your experiences also in transdisciplinarity here at IASS. So the questions are: do your research experiences at IASS align with the research mode clusters that we identified? And then more specifically, how do you balance scholarly publishing interactions with practitioners and the demand for societal impact of research projects? And in general, I would like to discuss how transdisciplinary research can be supported to balance these often competing demands between publishing and generating societal impact. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to discuss.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was a quite interesting analysis of the different clusters. And who would like to start us off with questions or experiences actually you would like to share on the topic? Diana, please.
Hello, hey Stephanie, thanks a lot for the interesting talk. I very much enjoyed it. Very interesting findings. I was mostly interested, or found it quite interesting, that you had this tension between scientific impact and societal impact, because that's, I think, something that I came also across. So I was wondering if you could maybe tell a little bit more, why might this be the case? I don't know if you talk to different researchers. And this is actually one of the challenges I also meet in my research project. So I'm part of a bigger EU project. I think we are somehow in cluster 3, I would say. So we work with different stakeholders, but definitely are not at the transdisciplinary really side yet. But I think, there's always this issue of time. But I wonder if it's also about the different strengths of researchers, right? That you have different people, you need different abilities also to interact with different stakeholders. If there might be different other reasons, why there are those differences. But that's something, we always have in the team, the debates, right? How to, if you need to go towards more societal impact, or if you just do really great scientific research, and then you will also get this impact, because you also show that, if you look at IPPC, right? Once you're cited there, you have really a big societal impact. So that's, quite interesting. So maybe I would be interested to hear more your viewpoint maybe on that. And then maybe off the topic, but you can also maybe come back later to it, is around the issue of COVID. If you, during your research process, did you address this issue of the containment measures under the COVID-19, and how this maybe has impacted also these different effects. But I'm not sure when you collected your data, if it was falling in this period or if it was before. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, for these interesting observations and also your questions. Yeah, maybe I first answer on the second question. So the research took place before COVID, so this was no topic that we addressed. But for sure, I think this, will be addressed in future research, because I assume that it has large impact on transdisciplinary research processes. Getting back to your question about why is this the case, that there's this disbalance between scientific impact and public publications. We didn't ask the people or the interviewees about that, but in the literature we found some hints on that. For example, in the work of Jana Teichler and colleagues, they found when they interviewed researchers in transdisciplinary research, they asked what for them describes a successful transdisciplinary research project, and all the interviewees or the by far highest amount of researchers said generating societal impact. So this seems to be the main goal of TD research. So it seems like these projects that see themselves as transdisciplinary seem mainly to pursue this goal and maybe abandon a little bit on other goals. So this might be one case. And then also we found another hint in the literature by Elon Bolton and colleagues, and they also interviewed scholars in TD projects, and they said that they don't really know how to present and also publish the knowledge that is generated during TD processes. So there seems also be a lack of capacity how to transfer these insights that you gain in TD processes into something that you can publish. Yeah, I hope that. So this is what we know about it right now. Thank you.
Thanks. Elon, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for a very interesting overview of TD from the standpoint, at least in terms of Germany. I have a couple of, first to follow exactly on the last sort of point you made. I have a concern that the difference in the academic output is largely a reflection of the journals that are available to people, and that the reviewing process very much prejudices some of this work. I think that's changing, but rather slowly. But I think it is what you're showing, I think is an important part to argue that in fact, where there is social impact, there sure as hell ought to be journals that reflect that, and that it's not just about the journals. The point is that it's also about tenure and promotion in academia, or for that matter, outside in some cases. So that's one point. And I think your research is very helpful in a sense in, making that point clear. Second thing I wanted to comment, which is in a sense, just from my own experience and curiosity about looking at this in different cultures, both, if you will, academic cultures, but also social cultures, different places. So one of them was the experience of working with the Arctic Council Sustainable Development Working Group, and finding, there was a lot of concern in that group, particularly from some of the indigenous communities, both in Siberia, in the US, in Canada, that the research really was prejudiced against them. and that transdisciplinarity was something that made sense to them in principle, but was not always easy to accept. I mean, from their end. And it took me a while to understand, and some of that has to do with the very ugly stories of childhood, separation and all kinds of other things that went on under colonial rule in Canada and the US, perhaps elsewhere, I don't know, but those two for sure. So doing genuinely collaborative transdisciplinary work took extra steps to get past that real fear and anger over it. Last point, I just want to mention that I'm in the middle of working with a group at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature in Kyoto. I've been working with them for the last 10 years. And I see a slightly different tension, maybe. I mean, I think your identification is helpful. In that case, I see a tension between a strong sense of community and the community willingness to engage, and as a community very often, in some very interesting ways, but it's a tension with hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So if there are, Dr. So-and-so, Professor so-and-so, it's very hard to get people to talk. And it takes building, this is probably true everywhere, but maybe more so in some cultures, because you have to get past the assumptions about, big levels in academic background or whatever, which are totally meaningless in what you're trying to do, but nonetheless enter into it. Anyway. It's certainly interesting to think about this in terms of different cultures and in a sense to understand better why they are different in different cultures, what contributes to that, and what makes it more viable or more informative in some cases and not in others. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Elon, for these important comments. I absolutely agree that it would be so interesting to look at the TD in different cultures, and also, of course, in a more international level, because our research is focused on the German research system, and of course, there's a specific culture as well as styles, and it would be really cool to have a larger comparison of different projects in different contexts. I think there would be a lot of learning possibility for that in that. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Steve, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for that presentation, Stephanie. I have enough questions for a whole other 2-hour conversation, so I'll try and limit it to a couple. One was on the capacity piece. So in our team meeting this morning, myself and Felix and Lena, who are on the call today, we were talking a little bit about maybe focusing on sort of team or project composition around capacity. So for example, Ian Fazy and colleagues wrote a paper on 10 principles for action-oriented research, and they talked about different researcher roles and orientations and so on. And there's been a lot of work in TD around early career capacities and skill sets and so on for doing TD. But most of what I've seen has been very much focused on the individual. And I think as an individual researcher, there might always be that tension between, on one hand, okay, I've got to book the room and make sure there's food and invite people, and I've got to write a journal article. So that's kind of a tension. But thinking more about what may be the capacities of a team and what are the kind of project compositions that we may want to look at. So that was one piece that I thought. I'd be curious if there was insights from your research on that. But then the other piece was on this kind of tension of the societal impact and kind of the lack of stakeholders, especially on the academic one, where I guess on one side, you could sort of almost say there's an argument that TD doesn't matter. If we can get societal impact without involving stakeholders, like in your category 1, then why are we bothering? Because collaboration is hard, it's difficult, we have all these issues. But on the other hand, I could argue, and this is kind of my own personal philosophy, that not involving stakeholders, not involving people who are part of this research are going to be impacted is both normatively wrong, but also generates a lack of legitimacy. There may be instrumental values, and people have written about this in public participation theory for a while. So I'm curious on, like, can we actually say that, like, for example, when I wrote a paper on justice and transitions, we kind of concluded by saying that sustainability transitions that don't consider justice are not sustainable. So we were kind of making a strong normative claim there. So could we also make a claim that societal impact that does not involve stakeholders is not sustainable? So I'm curious your thoughts on those, kind of two different questions, but curious your thoughts on those.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, maybe first on the project composition. Yeah, I think this is really interesting. Maybe something that I could say on that based on our research is that the large and comparative study and the results of which I presented today was complemented by a more in-depth study of a smaller number of projects by my colleague Judith Kahle. And she somehow found out that to balance a little bit between scientific impact and also publications and so on, that for the projects it was interesting, or it was fruitful to have a more of a kind of division of labor. So there were people that were more focused on their disciplinary strand and published. And then there were others on the team that were more involved in the TD activities and somehow pursuing this strand. So yeah, and for these projects, this way was kind of successful to reach both goals. Of course, this opens the question. So yeah, okay, but how is this disciplinary strand where people publish connected to the TD part of the project and so on? So yeah, but this would be also something that I would be interested to closer look at, at the different roles and how they contribute to these different goals scientifically and societally. And then your question on our cluster 1, where no practitioners were involved and that reached substantial societal impact and legitimacy. I would say, first I have to say that our cluster 1 is rather small, so it would be good to have a larger number of projects to somehow replicate these findings or look at it again. But still, what I find interesting about it is that this cluster, despite not involving practitioners, it has this high level of societal productivity, which is also involving measures for science communication and dissemination. And other TD projects also use science communication and dissemination as a way to further bring their research results to a wider audience. So first to shed a little bit more light on this mechanism. So it seems to be, or it might be also their way of communicating their findings that leads to this societal impact that they have. And then I would say, my perspective on this is more that in sustainability science, these findings are more also very interesting maybe for people that are doing program management, for example, at the BMBF or whatever, so looking or seeing that transdisciplinary research, while involving stakeholders and of course gaining legitimacy on the solutions that they provide by the involvement of stakeholders, is one way of tackling the problem, and another way might be more classical research that also to a certain degree can help us solve these sustainability problems. So I wouldn't say it's the one cluster versus the other, but maybe maybe it makes sense to wisely combine these different modes in research programs. Yeah, that would be my take on that. Okay.
Hey, thank you. Diana, please.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I actually also just wanted to comment on this bit provocative statement by Steve. And I would actually rather also argue like a bit like Stephanie did, and saying for me, it rather shows that, we really have to think critical when we need transdisciplinary research and when we don't need it. So I think there's a lot of fundamental research which doesn't maybe not necessarily need a strong engagement of different stakeholders, and also like other research, like even like in the first cluster one, can be really problem driven. So it doesn't mean that like, oh, what is done there is like taken out of blue, right? It's often like really like big problems in society where we provide solutions. And I mean, I brought up this example of the IPCC work where you have like, if you think about the PIC, right, like the Potsdam Climate Institute, they have like tons of teams and they have like a lot of capacity to do quickly stuff and produce really relevant research, while we sometimes actually fail to do so. So we are kind of sometimes slow and don't bring up like, the responses to pressing issues as I personally would maybe sometimes wish for. So I think, yeah, it really depends, I guess, on the context and where it might be needed. But nevertheless, yeah, if you, especially I think for kind of local level and really says, where you really engage with society, then I think like the transdisciplinary research is like really, really useful. But I think it's really important that we critically reflect also on ourselves, like what can be reached with transdisciplinary research and what it cannot provide. So that's just what I wanted to add. I think, Elon, you also raised your hand at the same time, so maybe you have a different opinion here or not.
Well, just to follow a little bit on that, I just wanted to make the comment that, I certainly understand the rationale in terms of the normative aspect of it and the value of engaging with the society if you're going to be proposing solutions and involved in it. And a particular example that we're just working on, we just submitted a paper to Futures that addresses this in the sense of narratives that are the basis of the SSPs, of the social, whatever it is, shared socioeconomic pathways that are being used. And the problem there is that those are supposed to, they should have great social impact. The problem is that they're very top down and they are created in large, sort of global chunks. And they lose, in my view, some of the value that they could bring to communities, or to, if you will, a more regional, a downscaled level. And I think at that point, the transdisciplinarity is crucial in understanding better what those narratives that drive the SSPs might really be that are salient for different communities. So I think that's the other side of coming in with transdisciplinary research that does need, even at multiple scales, does need to attend to that.
Thanks. Diana, do you just want to comment on Elon directly?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I just wanted to add, like, I think the importance is really to distinguish between like global developments, right? And the socioeconomic pathways, they are global, right? They show what is happening on the globe, and that's therefore they don't reflect like the realities and specific contents and local issues. So I think we just need to be sure that that's not what they tend to be. And of course, like if you look into studies in specific country context, I think, yeah, as you say, like it's very important to look like into specific issues that are actually happening on the ground there. You need for transdisciplinary research, but like that's not like the intention by those global storylines. So.
Okay, thanks. Stephanie, after witnessing this exchange, what is your opinion?
I think I already made clear my point a little bit by saying, okay, there's not one mode that fits all in sustainability science, but I'm more for wisely combining different modes of research and really adjusting them to the problem and also to the stakeholder field. This is somehow my a little bit more, my perspective. And then maybe something structural, which is also maybe interesting for you to know, is that these 59 research projects that we looked at, they are a subsample of our parent, or they are a sample of our parent population that is consisting of 156 projects, which we identified, which are all sustainability related research projects in this time frame that we had, that are sustainability oriented, interdisciplinary with a social science share. And our subsample is representative of these projects in funding sum, funding duration, and also when it comes to the topic defined by the funding line, in which funding line this project is funded. So for example, research on land use or economics for sustainable development and so on. So if we assume that our sample is representative for all the research that had taken place in that time, and only 6 of these 59 projects were not transdisciplinary or were not involving stakeholders to a certain degree, I find this really interesting, because right now I feel like transdisciplinarity often has the impulse to say like, oh yeah, we are a minority and we are marginalized and nobody's taking us seriously and so on. But our sample rather shows that in this context that we looked, stakeholder involvement is rather the common thing. And just a side note on that.
Okay, thanks. Are there any other questions or comments at this point?
Maybe briefly, like, yeah, Stephanie, I think you're completely right. I think also from my experience that like all like bigger projects, like especially on the EU level, they have to involve stakeholders. But I guess we are still like, you know, that doesn't mean that they are transdisciplinary, right? So I think we need to be sure. So I don't know like how small the sample was. And maybe adding to the question, I was wondering, do you have more information on the structure of the project? Like where they looked at, like, did they like look more like, you know, addressing national developments or local developments? Do you have, or like what was the kind of the context of the different projects? I think that could be nice. Like if you take this context of scale, I guess, like maybe also geography into account, I think it could be very interesting to see if we see some correlations there.
Thank you for this question. We actually did that, and I think it's in a table in the supplementary material of the paper. What did we find there? Yeah, we looked on the spatial perspective. So on which spatial perspective the projects focus. For example, whether they looked at the more municipal level, regional, national, international level. But what did we find? I think that we saw that, that's interesting. Maybe it also supports a little bit your observation that cluster 1, so the purely academic research cluster, has the highest level of projects that look on the international perspective, and is in that significantly different from all other clusters. So it seems like these projects more look on a larger scale, while the TD, the more interactive clusters, they more look on a more smaller scale, like regional and municipal. Yeah, we can see that a little bit in our data. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I think, Elon, you also wanted to come in. Otherwise, I would then have a question now.
Please go ahead.
Thanks. One thing we at the ISS have been always wondering how you can actually define and measure societal impact. There's always been a question for our evaluation by the German Science Council. And the thing is, you just mentioned is that you have 59 projects with, and you measured somehow societal impact. So you must have a common denominator. They must have a common denominator. And you just mentioned that the most societal impact, I mean, the cluster one has societal impact quite large, but they're focusing mostly on the international level. Now I find it even more difficult to identify societal impact on the international level. So just to learn more, how did you define, how did you measure societal impact on apparently from the local to the global scale?
Yeah, I have a backup slide on that. Maybe I can jump to that in a second. So yeah, I totally agree with you, Achim, that measuring societal impact is a big topic on its own. And what we did is that in our questionnaire, we were posing 2 open questions concerning the societal impact of the projects. And then we gathered all the qualitative answers that we got from the practitioners, and then we made a qualitative content analysis of this text material that we got, and we came up with a 5-point scale to quantify the depth, so the intensity of the societal impact. And the scale reaches from recognition, so whether the research results were recognized by societal actors, over discussion, which means the results were to a certain degree discussed among different stakeholders. Then we have the category test, which means the results were tested at least once in a practice field. Then we have the application as the 4th point of the scale, which means that it was really in actual use, the research results. And the 5th point is that the research results are continuously implemented, which can also be something like the continuation of
So I think we somehow, well, there was a glitch apparently. Okay, we are all back in the room.
Sorry, I was gone. What was the last thing that you heard?
The last thing I heard was that you ended at the point number 5, which was continuation, implementation, and explaining what that meant actually. That was the last thing I understood. Yeah.
So our scale somehow is, of course, an abstraction of the multitude of different societal impacts that took place in the projects.
Okay, thanks. We have some 3 minutes left. Any other questions, comments at this stage?
I'm just
maybe just not a question, but just a comment that, yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, my screen keeps jumping around, so I keep trying to find Stephanie on the boxes. But so this is wonderful to have Stephanie here talk. We're trying to find a time to actually bring Stephanie to Potsdam for hopefully a couple of days to be able to have a more in-depth discussion. So hopefully we'll be able to figure out a time to do that, maybe sitting out in the garden. So yeah, if you have more questions or discussion, that hopefully there'll be more time to continue that than the 2 minutes that we've got left today. So just wanted to flag that before we wrapped up.
No problem. Elon, you also wanted to come in?
Just to say that I appreciate your thoughts, Stephanie, on the impact. I'm not convinced by it, to be honest. I mean, it's not so much that, I mean, it makes sense what you looked at, but it is also, if you will, a subjective response from the researchers, if I understood it correct.
Yes.
So it's a question, would there be a way, do you think there is a way to correlate that somehow with, I mean, in some sense, a continuation, if you have that may be, you know, there's some external information about that, but policy perhaps also, and the question of who takes it up. If you have a discussion, who's talking? And why are they involved? That would be interesting to know a little more about.
Yeah, certainly. I would also agree that our impact scale is, of course, rather limited, and it had to be really overarching because we had to look at all these projects. But in another paper that we published, we have other impact scales as well that we used in the project. And one was that we also looked at, as you said, who is taking it up. So we looked at who are the which are the societal sectors in which the research projects have had this impact. And there we referred to these 4 sectors that I also referred to in our presentation. So governmental, private, civic, and citizens. So which is also rather broad. Yeah, but it would certainly be interesting to look at, are these people that are really in power, that really can change something, who's discussing with whom and so on, of course. But I think, maybe more in-depth qualitative research would be, or with a specific focus maybe then if you do it in a more quantitative way. Yeah, but certainly very important question.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. We are coming to the end of today's session, but as Steve has already indicated, this is not the end of the discussion, and we look very much forward actually to welcome you, Stephanie, at some point and continue that discussion. Other than that, I would wish you all a very nice afternoon, wherever you are currently, and see you around one way or the other. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.